Gertrude Stein was a genius. So says the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, the Met, and many others. But was she? Largely unknown until the 1933 publication of her autobiography, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which was Stein's life through the eyes of her lesbian lover, as written by Stein. Stein was little more than an American art collector in Paris for the majority of her life. The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas is an almost complete control of narrative from the one person who could tell it. Today, with all of the exhibits and fanfare, it would seem as if Stein was some sort of artistic contemporary of F. Scott Fitzgerald, when the reality was Gertrude Stein was a glorified art dealer, a medical school dropout, a very confused woman from a very rich family, who relied on her stepfather's Bachrach photography network to push modern art to America. One of the notable features of the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas is Stein's high-handed treatment of the lesser people in her artistic circle. She flattens them. Stein was both happy about and a little ashamed of the success of the book. The work was a fiction, a fictional account of Stein as she wanted to be. It was the only one of her works she made any money from, and she distinguished it from her unprofitable works by calling it an audience work, as opposed to the scholarly hermetic writings that she considered her real work. The 1933 book earned her lecture tours throughout the 1930s in the United States, where audiences noticed her stutter. By writing in Toklas's voice, Stein made herself speak a more conventional English than the English she speaks in her avant-garde works, full of strange repetition and an obsession with color. But what the audience liked about the book wasn't merely that they could understand it. The audience recognized the book was something truly original. The work is advanced and experimental, wild and subversive. It is, among the other things it is, an anti-biography. Stein's presentation of herself in the book as one of the world's greatest geniuses and of every other person as someone put on earth only to amuse or irritate her is arrogant and haughty and reflected in her life. Early in the book, she writes of a servant named Helene who worked for Stein and her brother Leo in the early days of their salon, which they established in their two-bedroom flat in Paris. According to Stein, Helene stayed with the household until the end of 1913. Then her husband, by that time she had married and had a little boy, insisted she work for others no longer. To her great regret, she left, and later she always said that life at home was never as amusing as it had been with us. Much later, only about 3 years ago, she came back for a year. She and her husband had fallen on bad times, and her boy was dead. She was as cheery as ever and enormously interested. She said, "Isn't it extraordinary? All of those people whom I knew when they were nobody are now always mentioned in the newspapers, and the other night over radio they mentioned the name of Monsieur Picasso." Stein's heartlessness, and her boy was dead, is apparent, and this little story serves to advance Picasso's career and little else. You can learn more about Pablo Picasso in his video on this channel. After Stein's death in 1946, Alice Toklas, her partner, pursued the protection and perpetuation of Stein's legend with matchless zeal and devotion. But Stein did not return the favor and left the bulk of her estate to her nephew. At the same time, without any slackening of her literary widow's efforts, and without Stein hovering over her shoulder, Toklas came into her own as a personality. She no longer sat with the wives of geniuses in the salon, the only one with a mustache. She began to have young men of her own. One of these, the novelist Donald Wyndham, who had become acquainted with Toklas in Rome in the spring of 1961, noted in a memoir called The Roman Spring of Alice Toklas that graciousness, unapologetic graciousness, was Alice Toklas's most pervasive characteristic that spring, a graciousness that made her plain features appear beautiful as soon as you were at ease with her. Wyndham's memoir includes letters from Toklas to him and his partner Sandy Campbell that illustrate this observation. Grace radiates from her letters to Wyndham and Campbell and from all her post-Stein correspondence, showing the real hold Stein had on her partner. Toklas called letter writing her work, and she did it very well. She emerges from her letters as a great lady, witty, self-deprecating, attentive, and cultivated. Her forays into what Henry James called the twaddle of graciousness are especially masterly. Here is a quote from when she is thanking the American journalist W.G. Rogers for a gift parcel she received from him and his wife Mildred in March 1947. I went into the bedroom and there was the package. I was so excited I forgot my exhaustion and boredom and opened it feverishly, but carefully undoing the string. And there were all the treasures. No, I just couldn't believe my eyes. The wonderful towels, the warm commies. Not a darn. New. The lavender soap. And then, oh then, the utterly lovely scarf. I never thought to see anything like it again, to say nothing of having it for my own. It's a royal gift, and it's overwhelmingly beautiful. In the evening I had a visit from my young Turkish painter, and I gave him a long lecture on the simplicity and at the same time subtlety of the American gift, the unerring taste, the appreciation of métier and quality that no European realizes or will accept. In another letter of thanks, this one for an exquisite nosegay holder, the twaddle becomes intertwined with a piece of history and a grudge. Quote, never have I ever seen anything so lovely, and it gives me so much pleasure, Toklas wrote to her friend Louise Taylor in January 1947, and went on, you see, when the Germans came, and then, well, we won't go into that, they took a great many things, but not a picture, not a drawing, not a piece of furniture, so that Gertrude wouldn't ever let me mention anything about it ever, because she said we got off mighty easily, and of course she was right. She absolutely used the pictures every minute of the day, and so that was all right, but the rooms lacked the prettiness and elegance they had, and sometimes I minded it secretly, and now, my dear, all the missing elegance has returned, and I thank you very deeply. What Toklas wouldn't go into, and what Gertrude wouldn't ever let her mention, could be the looting of linens and utensils from their apartment during the pair's wartime absence, but it could also be Gertrude's work as an agent and friendship with Nazi turncoat spies in Paris. Their painting collection remained in place. There was a moment of danger in July 1944 when 4 Gestapo men broke into the apartment on Rue Christine and threatened to cut up and burn the Picassos, which they rightfully saw as degenerate. Picasso's portrait of Stein is probably one of his few identifiable human works. In 1944, a resourceful neighbor called the French police, who were able to get the Gestapo men to leave by asking them for requisition orders that they did not have. When the police arrived, the Gestapo men were in Stein's bedroom trying on her Chinese coats. Stein was a huge fat woman, and so her clothes did fit men. As well as providing for Toklas upon her death in 1946, Stein provided for her own literary legacy. I desire my executors hereinafter named to pay to Carl Van Vechten of 101 Central Park West, New York City, such sum of money as the said Carl Van Vechten shall, in his absolute discretion, deem necessary for the publication of my unpublished manuscripts. Why this, when Toklas was an author herself? Why did she trust someone totally separate? In sending Toklas a monthly personal allowance of $400, Toklas quickly learned her legacy from Stein wasn't enough to live on, and she seized their paintings. This act has been treated with extreme suspicion by critics, but Leo Stein parted with dozens of Renoirs when he left their shared Paris apartment, leaving Gertrude and Alice behind in 1913. Alice cajoled and threatened. Alice was desperate and finally sold about 40 Picasso drawings without informing an executor in 1954, when Rubina, Gertrude's sister-in-law, who was keeping a beady eye upon the pictures in the interests of her minor children, discovered the Picasso drawings were gone. She began legal proceedings that ended in the raid on Toklas's apartment. In a letter of 1965, Daniel Stein, for all that he would be a beneficiary of his stepmother's interventions, wrote of Rubina with exuberant malice. She, quote, has always been a devious, hypocritical, and thoroughly unprincipled being, willing to stop at nothing to achieve her ends, whatever they were. She is something between a Mexican bandit and one of those Egyptian infiltrators who used to cross over into Israel and murder the children of the kibbutz in their beds. Okay. In his memoir, Alice and Gertrude and Others of 1971, Sutherland tells this story. The self-effacement which Alice is supposed to have cultivated, and which indeed was carried so far that her very existence was debated in the press, became a form of publicity in itself, and if she did subordinate herself to Gertrude, in public at least, she was not at all the sort willingly to disappear. I had been put straight about her existence long ago when I turned up at the apartment with a large bouquet of small roses for Gertrude. I did something that should have been unpardonable. I gave the bouquet to Alice at the door as one would give it to a maid, who would then fetch a vase for it. But Alice brought the bouquet and me at once into the living room, saying, "Look, lovey, what Donald has brought me. Thank you so much. How did you know? These are just my favorite flowers." Then she went to get a vase. Sutherland was put straight about Toklas's steel, but like many people who knew both women, he preferred Stein's gold. During a final visit he makes to Toklas in 1966, she died in 1967, a memory of Stein comes to him. Toklas has brought up Hemingway and says, "You know, I made Gertrude get rid of him. I know," I said. "I know it not only by inference from the book A Movable Feast. I also knew something we had never discussed, that the relationship between Gertrude Stein and Hemingway was more than literary comradeship at one time, or even more than maternal and filial affection. I heard Hemingway had not infrequently said in conversation, and once at least in a letter, that he had always wanted to lay her. Maybe he did." The letter Sutherland means was written to W.G. Rogers on the occasion of the publication of his memoir, When This You See, Remember Me, Gertrude Stein in Person of 1948. Hemingway wrote, "She used to talk to me about homosexuality and how it was fine in and for women and no good to men, and I used to listen and learn, and I always wanted to fuck her, and she knew it." Sutherland goes on, "I could well believe it. For the second time I met her she came too close, and my response was both unequivocal and, considering that I was 19 and she 60, bewildering. She said in a book I was very nervous when we first met. Nervous would be not the word for me the second time." Hemingway's line is the sort of macho showing off that one expects of him and only half believes, and you can learn more about Hemingway's poor relationship with the truth on this channel. But Sutherland's account has the ring of whole truth. Fatuski, as Stein called herself in the erotic poem Lifting Belly, was always on the hunt for anyone to give her attention. She seemed to embody a belief that it was only women who could be truly masculine, because they looked at masculinity from the outside in. It was no wonder that Alice was jealous of everyone, male or female, who came too close. In Alice and Gertrude and Others, Sutherland writes of visiting Toklas in 1965 at a nursing home where she is recovering from a broken hip. She had been evicted from her apartment in 1964, the sale of Picasso's only going so far. He finds her sitting up in an armchair dressed in a dressing gown, which was not fresh, and on which she had dribbled. He asked her as delicately as he could about her finances, and learned that she was penniless, without even the pin money to send a maid out for a newspaper or a bottle of water. Sutherland thrusts a few hundred francs into her purse and then reflected on the general problem of looking after her. The friends who established a fund are afraid of giving it to her, lest she spend it foolishly and run through it in a few months or less. Conrad wrote in his memoir, "It was difficult to satisfy Alice Toklas's tastes, which were still extravagant. I remember tricking her by having fruit brought at the market and having it brought to her in used bags. This gave her the illusion of eating the best food Paris had to offer and of offering her visitors sherry of noble origins." But Sutherland's own fears are not about fancy food, they are about Catholic dogma. He worried about Toklas's worry that her plan of meeting Gertrude in heaven will go awry. According to Catholic dogma and Toklas, the unbaptized and very Jewish Stein was in limbo. How did one go about getting Gertrude out of limbo? With enough prayer, enough masses and candles, enough penitence, Gertrude could be strung, Toklas said, and settled in purgatory to await Alice before they went on together to heaven. It could be made very expensive, and it is possible that if Alice had a perfectly free hand, all or most of the Picasso collection would now be in the Vatican Museum. Sutherland ends this mordant aria by noting of Toklas that her own salvation was endangered now, for her confessor, finding her without money, ceased to visit her. Her 1963 book, What is Remembered, seemed ignored in light of the official account of her relationship with Stein, penned in 1932 by Stein. Virgil Thomson, in his 1966 autobiography, records a conversation with Gertrude Stein about a difference he saw between Jews and Christians. Jews, Thomson said, are always breaking up with their friends, while Christians make up after quarrels. The explanation I offered for such independent behavior was that the Jewish religion, though it sets aside a day for private atonement, offers no mechanics for forgiveness. When a Christian, on the other hand, knows he has done wrong to anyone, he is obliged in all honesty to attempt restitution, and the person he has wronged must thereupon forgive. Stein took no umbrage at this and mulled it over for 20 years. She liked this explanation, and for nearly 20 years it remained our convention. Thomson adds, it was not until after Gertrude's death that Alice Toklas said one day, you and Gertrude had it settled between you as to why Jews don't make up their quarrels, and I went along with you. But now I've found a better reason for it. Gertrude was right, of course, to believe that when a Jew dies, he's dead. And that's exactly why Jews don't need to make up. When we've had enough of someone, we can get rid of him. You Christians can't, because you've got to spend eternity together. We can get rid of him, she said. The we leaps off the page. In no other memoir, in no letter, or in any book or article does Toklas identify herself as a Jew, but she was. However, she did convert to Catholicism, and she was quick to assume a Christian identity. The term Our Lord Jesus Christ rolled easily off her pen in a letter written the day after her admission to the church. In When This You See, Remember Me, Rogers writes of a car trip in the French countryside with Stein and Toklas, during which the two women constantly fought. Every arrangement was an occasion for dispute. Stein was the naughty child who wanted to have fun no matter what, and Toklas was the grown-up. It was as if Miss Stein's practical sense had been removed from her person and deposited in the person of Miss Toklas. The ego was in the front seat, Stein did the driving dangerously, and the alter ego in the back. The battle which most geniuses fight within themselves was exteriorized and fought openly between her and her friend. Do you not get tired of always being right? Stein wrote in an abstruse late work called The Geographical History of America. This was, on some level, addressing Toklas, but the difference was Stein could afford to act this way, and Toklas and many others could not. Gertrude Stein, the youngest of a family of 5 children, was born on February 3, 1874, in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, which merged with Pittsburgh in 1907, to wealthy Jewish parents Daniel Stein and Amelia Stein, née Kaiser. Her father was a wealthy businessman with real estate holdings. Both German and English were spoken in their home. Gertrude's siblings were Michael, born in 1865, Simon, born in 1868, Bertha, born in 1870, and Leo, born in 1872. Gertrude was the youngest. Leo, Michael, Bertha, and Gertrude would live. Simon would not, and there is some scholarship to indicate there were 2 children who died young. When Stein was 3 years old, she and her family moved to Vienna and then Paris. Accompanied by governesses and tutors, the Steins endeavored to imbue their children with the cultured sensibilities of European life. After a year-long sojourn abroad, perhaps due to Simon dying, they returned to America in 1878, settling in Oakland, California, where her father became director of San Francisco's streetcar lines, the Market Street Railway. Stein attended First Hebrew Congregation of Oakland's Sabbath School. During their residence in Oakland, they lived very comfortably for 4 years on a 10-acre lot. She would often go on excursions with her brother Leo, with whom she developed a close relationship and would live with for years in Paris. Stein found school unstimulating, but often read Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Scott, Burns, Smollett, Fielding, and others. When Stein was 14 years old, her mother died. 3 years later, her father died. Stein's eldest brother, Michael, aged 26, took over the family business holdings, moved his 4 siblings to San Francisco, where he was the director of the Market Street Cable Railway Company, and in 1892 arranged for Gertrude and her sister Bertha to live with their mother's family in Baltimore. Here she lived with her uncle David Bachrach, who in 1877 had married Gertrude's maternal aunt, Fanny Kaiser. Bachrach was a huge spokesperson for photography and had many connections to the art world. Bachrach remains a family-run business to this day. In Baltimore, Stein met Clarabelle and Etta Cohn, who held Saturday evening salons that she would later emulate in Paris. The Cohns shared an appreciation for art and conversation and modeled a domestic division of labor between two women that Stein would replicate in her relationship with Alice B. Toklas. Some of Gertrude's writing about this period hinted about incest on her father's part, which no one appears to dispute. In 1893, Gertrude went with her brother Leo to Harvard, where she studied English and psychology at Radcliffe College. In 1898, she went to medical school at Johns Hopkins University, but failed to graduate, focusing more of her time on her infatuation with female students than on her studies. She never wanted to go to medical school, and the fact that she got into one of the best medical schools in the country is indicative of her privilege. The fact that she had access to such education as a woman also may have contributed to her relative patriotism compared to later wave feminists. Writing of this period in her life, such as 1903's in Things as They Are, Stein often revealed herself as a depressed young woman dealing with a culture that didn't immediately uplift her for no reason, struggling to find her own identity, which she realized she could not conform to the conventional female role. Her uncorseted physical appearance and eccentric mode of dress aroused comments. She was described as big and floppy and sandaled and not caring a damn. Despite this, people thought well enough of her that she was asked to give a lecture to a group of Baltimore women in 1899. She gave a controversial speech titled The Value of College Education for Women, probably designed to provoke the largely middle-class audience. In the lecture, Stein maintained average middle-class woman supported by some male relative, a husband, or father or brother is not worth her keep economically considered. This economic dependence causes her to become oversexed, adapting herself to the abnormal sex desire of the male and becoming a creature that should have been first a human being and then a woman into one that is a woman first and always. The hatred for the feminine and the relationship between the sexes really blossomed while in Paris. But while a student at Johns Hopkins and purportedly still naive about sexual matters, she pursued lesbian relationships. Sometime in 1899 or 1900, she became infatuated with Mary, or May Bookstaver, who was involved in a relationship with a medical student, Mabel Haynes. Witnessing the relationship between the two women served for Stein as an awakening. The unhappy love triangle demoralized Stein, arguably contributing to her decision to abandon her medical studies. Bookstaver and Haynes would later both marry men, but Toklas was threatened enough to demand Stein burn Bookstaver's letters. In 1902, Stein's brother Leo left for London and Stein followed. The following year, the two relocated to Paris, where Leo hoped to pursue an art career. Gertrude decided to focus her energies on writing. Her first novel, which she wrote after joining Leo in Paris, was Q.E.D., an account of her love affair with Bookstaver, and it was one of the few works she never tried to publish. It was during these early years in Paris that she met Picasso and began buying many of his paintings, along with those of Matisse and Cezanne. But this was no slim bohemian existence. The joint collection of Gertrude and Leo Stein began in late 1904 when their brother Michael announced their trust account, which Leo had been contributing to by making art collection connections, had accumulated a balance of 8,000 francs. Gertrude and Leo spent this in Ballard's gallery, buying the child predator Gauguin's sunflowers and 3 Tahitians, Cezanne's bathers, and 2 Renoirs. Art critic for the New York Sun, Henry McBride, did a lot for Stein's reputation in the United States, publicizing her art acquisitions and her importance as a cultural figure, even though no one really knew her name until the 1940s when she was a guest of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and even then it was questionable. Of the art collection at the Stein Studio, 27 Rue de Fleur, McBride commented, "In proportion to its size and quality, it is just about the most potent of any that I have ever heard of in history." McBride also observed that Gertrude collected geniuses rather than masterpieces. She recognized them a long way off. There were also much easier to photograph these modern pieces with large swaths of color than the delicacy of a Turner, for example. And with Stein's connections to the photography world through her Baltimore life, this was a very important feature. By late 1910, the modest 2-bedroom apartment at 27 Rue de Fleur that Leo initially rented for himself was home to 3 occupants, Leo, Gertrude, and her companion, Alice Toklas. Leo's increasing deafness led him to distance himself from their Saturday evening salons, and by early 1913 he recognized it was time for him to leave. The presence of Alice was a godsend, as it enabled the thing to happen without any explosion, Leo explained to a friend. Gertrude hungers and thirsts for glory, and it was, of course, a serious thing for her that I can't abide her riding, and think it abominable. To this has been added my utter refusal to accept the later phases of Picasso, with whose tendency Gertrude has so closely allied herself. Both Picasso and Gertrude are using their intellects, which they ain't got, to do what they would need the finest critical tact, which they ain't got neither, and they are in my belief turning out the most God-almighty rubbish that is to be found. Leo and Gertrude divided their art collection. Gertrude kept the Picassos, and Leo took 16 Renoirs, rather an amusing baggage for a leader in the great modern fight, he conceded. Leo was relieved to live a quieter, simple life, marrying Nina Azouez in 1921. He spent the rest of his years in Italy, France, and the United States, painting, writing, and lecturing about aesthetics. The split between brother and sister was acrimonious. Stein did not see Leo again until after World War I, and then through only a brief greeting on the street in Paris. After this accidental encounter, they never saw or spoke to each other again. Meanwhile, back at the studio, Gertrude and Alice renovated the atelier, installing electricity, a fireplace, and a new doorway with a small portico that connected it to the apartment. Gertrude removed the frames from most of her paintings, accentuating her more orderly display. She focused on writing and finding publishers for her modern texts. "I would be so much more pleased if you were more interested in my work than in my personality," she explained to the editor of Vanity Fair. "It really is the only literature that has come out of America since Henry James," she said about her own work. Her friends noted that in books such as Tender Buttons and The Making of Americans, Gertrude was doing the same thing in literature that Matisse and Picasso were doing in art, which is not clear. Leo and Gertrude owned more than 100 drawings by Picasso. It was not unusual for the siblings to purchase groups of sketches directly from him as soon as they were made. A few were framed and displayed on their walls, but the majority were kept in portfolios and brought out for interested guests who didn't have to pay to go to an art gallery for the experience. The Steins encouraged their friends to buy drawings and watercolors from Picasso as well. In the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, Gertrude recalled that Etta Cohn, a friend from Baltimore, found the Picassos appalling but romantic. She was taken there by Gertrude Stein whenever the Picasso finances got beyond everybody, and was made to buy 100 francs worth of drawings. After all, 100 francs in those days was $20. She was quite willing to indulge in this romantic charity. Needless to say, those drawings became in very much later years the nucleus of her collection. Gertrude attributed the beginnings of Saturday evening salons to Matisse, as people began visiting to see his paintings and those of Cezanne. Matisse brought people, everybody brought somebody, and they came at any time, and it began to be a nuisance. And it was in this way that Saturday evenings began, she said. No one wanted to see Stein, they wanted to see the art on the walls without paying or waiting for a gallery opening. Ernest Hemingway frequented Stein's salon, but the two had an uneven relationship. They began as close friends, with Hemingway admiring Stein as a mentor, but they later grew apart, especially after Stein called Hemingway yellow, or a coward, in the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Upon the birth of his son, Hemingway asked Stein to be the godmother of his child. While Stein has been credited with inventing the term lost generation for those whose defining moment in time and coming of age had been World War I and its aftermath, and is repeatedly referred to expatriates, there are at least 3 versions of the story that led to the phrase, 2 by Hemingway and 1 by Stein. Stein met her life partner, Alice B. Toklas, on September 8, 1907, on Toklas's first day in Paris at Sarah and Michael Stein's apartment. Stein was 3 years Toklas's senior. On meeting Stein, Toklas wrote, "She was a golden brown presence, burned by the Tuscan sun, and with a golden glint in her warm brown hair. She was dressed in a warm brown corduroy suit. She wore a large round coral brooch, and when she talked very little or laughed a good deal, I thought her voice came from this brooch. It was unlike anyone else's voice, deep, full, velvety, like a great contralto's, like 2 voices." Soon after, Stein introduced Toklas to Pablo Picasso. In 1922, the 2 women entertained Man Ray at their studio, and you can learn more about Man Ray and his involvement in the Black Dahlia murder on this channel. Stein would generate money by selling Matisses to her own family members. In the 1980s, a cabinet in the Yale University Beinecke Library, which had been locked for an indeterminate number of years, was opened and found to contain some 300 love letters written by Stein and Toklas. They were made public for the first time, revealing intimate details of their relationship. Stein's endearment for Toklas was Baby Precious. In turn, Stein was for Toklas Mr. Cuddle Wuddle. Stein was only able to define herself through the ideas of Otto Weniger's Sex and Character of 1906. Weniger, though Jewish by birth, considered Jewish men effeminate and women as incapable of selfhood and genius, except for female homosexuals who may approximate masculinity. Stein equated genius with masculinity, and her position as a female and an intellectual became difficult to synthesize. Despite this, she pushed against authoritarian political paternal figures and described them as too much fathering and depressing in the 1940s. She called for mothers to come into the public scene despite not being a mother herself. The essay Miss Fur and Miss Skeen is one of the first homosexual revelation stories to be published, although Tender Buttons refers repeatedly to a closet. The work, like QED, is informed by Stein's growing involvement with the homosexual community, although it was based on lesbian partners. Her work contains the word gay over 100 times, perhaps the first published use of the word gay in reference to same-sex relationships and those who have them. A similar essay of gay men by Stein begins more obviously with the line, "Sometimes men are kissing." And so we see Stein's ability to change words and their meanings. In Tender Buttons, Stein comments on lesbian sexuality, and the work abounds with highly condensed layers of public and private meanings. The poem is very long and very difficult to read, almost like reading drunken ramblings. Despite not living in America for decades, Stein felt the need to comment on American policy during her lecture tour in 1934. In a 1934 interview published in the New York Times, she stated, "That is the reason why I do not approve of the stringent immigration laws in America today. We need the stimulation of new blood. It is best to favor healthy competition. There is no reason why we should not select our immigrants with greater care, nor why we should not bar certain peoples and preserve the color line, for instance. But if we shut down on immigration completely, we shall become stagnant. The French may not like the competition of foreigners, but let them in. They accept the challenge and derive the stimulus. I am surprised that there is not more discussion of immigration in the United States than there is. We have got rid of prohibition restrictions, and it seems to me the next thing we should do is to relax the severity of immigration restrictions. With immigrants now comprising a greater population than the majority of American states, Stein's words fall flat. To Stein, the Industrial Revolution was a negative social force, disrupting stability, degrading values, and affecting cultural decline. She idealized the 18th century as the golden age of civilization, epitomized in America as the era of its founding fathers, and what was in France the glory of its pre-revolution. She poured some of this patriotism into her Susan B. Anthony opera, 1947's The Mother of Us All. Stein proclaimed that Hitler merited the Nobel Peace Prize, but advocated for Germans to become disorganized so they could lose World War I. She wrote, "The Saxon element is always destined to be dominated. The Germans have no gift at organizing. They can only obey. And obedience is not organization. Organization comes from community of will as well as community of action. And in America, our democracy has been based on community of will and effort. I say Hitler ought to have the Peace Prize because he is removing all elements of contest and struggle from Germany. By driving out the Jews and the democratic left elements, he is driving out everything that conduces to activity. That means peace." Stein died in July 1946 at the age of 72 after surgery for inoperable stomach cancer at the American hospital near Paris. She was interred in Paris in Père Lachaise Cemetery. Later, Alice B. Toklas was buried alongside her. In her last years, Toklas sank into poverty. What Dada Conrad took over with Janet Flanner was the horrible tangle of Toklas's finances and the task of soliciting money from her friends to keep her barely afloat and discussing whether they should give her any money at all. Toklas's financial difficulties derived from Gertrude Stein's will. Stein did and didn't provide for her, quote, wife of 40 years. She wrote her will in July 1946 after she had a diagnosis of stomach cancer and was awaiting the useless surgery that ended her existence. She left her money and her collection of paintings to Toklas, but only for her use for life, a momentary stop on the way to their true destination, Stein's nephew Alan, the only son of her brother Michael Stein. Was this devotion to kin an object of Stein's never quite extinguished civilized side, when she advocated for so much degeneracy in her life?